When the foresters found that cabin hanging 12 feet above the ground, it looked like the forest had grown around it to hide a secret. The wood was gray and swollen from years of rain, its corners filled with moss. Inside, the air was dry and still. A skeleton sat against the far wall, its head bowed like it had been waiting, and nailed across the door from the inside were 3 weathered planks. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Back then, Ketchikan still had that sleepy rhythm only coastal towns can keep. Ferries came and went twice a day. The rain never really stopped, it just changed tempo. Most mornings I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, listening to it patter on the metal roof, watching the gulls circle the harbor and the fishing boats heading out before dawn. Life here ran on trust. Folks left their trucks unlocked. Dogs wandered between porches, and the loudest thing in town was the foghorn echoing across the channel. I'd retired from the Forest Service 3 years earlier, but still helped coordinate search calls when hikers went missing. Out here, the forest can turn on you fast, not out of malice, but indifference. You respect it or you don't come back. That was the quiet rule we all understood. Patrick O'Hara arrived that July looking like the kind of man who did. He wasn't the wide-eyed tourist type. He moved with the calm of someone who had logged miles alone, the kind of steady composure you see in people who spend real time outdoors. I met him the morning he came by Gary Weston's shop. I was having coffee with Gary, same as I did most days. Patrick had come in looking for a particular brand of fuel canister and some waterproof matches. I remember Gary giving me that look, the one that said, "Here's a man who knows what he's doing." Patrick was polite but focused. Everything he bought was practical. No gimmicks, no shiny gear. He told us he planned to hike along the outer section of the coastal route, not the one tourists take, but the old game paths that run deep into the Tongass. 17 million acres of forest, most of it untouched since before statehood. Out there, the trees grow so tight you can feel the air change. We talked a bit about the weather, how the fog had been rolling in thicker than usual that summer, and he just smiled. Said fog didn't bother him. "It's the quiet I'm after," he told us. Then he slung that pack over his shoulder and walked out toward the docks. I remember the sound of his boots on the wet boards fading into the morning drizzle. That was the last time anyone in town saw him. Still, back then, there was nothing strange about a man like Patrick heading out alone. Folks around here do that all the time. The forest was his church, the solitude his prayer. He'd done this before British Columbia, Yukon, always careful, always on schedule. His sister Linda told me later that he'd sent her a text before leaving the trailhead. Short and neat, just like him, heading out. "Everything's according to plan. Next contact in 8 days. She wasn't worried. None of us would have been. That week drifted by like they always did. Rain in the mornings, wind off the water in the evenings. I spent my days helping a neighbor mend a fence and my nights reading by the stove. Every once in a while, the weather radio would crackle with reports of fog up near the ridges, but that was nothing new. Around here, the forest breathes its own weather, thick mists that roll in without warning and swallow whole valleys. By the time the 8th day came and went, no one thought much of it. Satellite service fails out there all the time. But when Linda called the troopers on the 12th, her voice trembling through a bad connection, something in my gut tightened. Not fear exactly, more like the sudden stillness before a storm. Looking back, I can trace the unease to that first morning in Gary's shop. The way Patrick double-checked the new compass against his old one, turning them both slowly in his hands, as if he didn't quite trust the readings. He laughed about it, said something about never wanting to lose true north. It was the kind of small moment you forget until later when you start wondering if maybe that's where the story started to bend. The night before his text stopped coming, the sky had gone an odd color, not dark but heavy like light pressed through smoke. The rain had that cold edge it gets when summer begins to slip. I remember standing outside on my porch listening to it drum against the eaves and thinking how quickly a man could vanish in those woods without a sound. But at the time, none of us were thinking in terms of vanishings. We still lived in that calm before, when you believe the forest gives back what it takes, when you believe experience is enough. Patrick believed it too. Linda later told me she had a strange dream that week. She saw her brother standing among trees so tall she couldn't see the sky. He was waving, but he wasn't smiling. She woke up at 3 a.m. and almost called him, but she didn't want to disturb his trip. She went back to sleep instead. It's funny how memory works. You look back and realize how many quiet warnings you missed, how the air felt heavier that week, how the gulls gathered inland before the rain. But that's how life moves in a town like ours, steady, familiar, and blind to its own turning points. The day before we got the call, Gary was sitting outside the shop whittling a piece of cedar. He asked me if I thought that hiker from Seattle would make it back before the weekend. I told him, if he's half as careful as he looked, he's probably already on the ferry. We both laughed. By sundown, the fog rolled in thick enough to hide the mountains across the channel. The harbor lights blurred into halos on the water, and for a moment the whole town looked like it was floating. I remember locking up my shed, hearing the wind shift through the trees behind my house, a low, slow sound that carried farther than usual. I told myself it was just the weather changing. That night, Linda called again, her voice breaking between words. Patrick still hadn't checked in. I promised her it was probably nothing, a dead battery, a bad signal, something simple. But as I hung up, I found myself staring out toward the forest, watching the clouds roll like smoke over the ridges. The rain had stopped, but the wind hadn't. And somewhere out there beyond the glow of town, a single porch light burned through the fog, one of those old search lamps we keep for when somebody's late coming home. It stayed on all night. That porch light was still burning when I got the call the next morning. Linda's voice on the other end was shaking, not hysterical, just tired in that way only worry can wear someone down. She said Patrick still hadn't texted. No made it back. No safe at camp. Nothing. I told her I'd drive into town and talk to the troopers that we'd get the search rolling before nightfall. She thanked me, though her voice broke on the word. After I hung up, I sat there at the kitchen table for a long time listening to the steady drizzle against the windows. The forest outside my house disappeared into the fog, the same fog that had taken him. It had a way of making the whole world smaller, like every sound was coming from underwater. By noon, I was at the state trooper post, a squat building that always smelled like coffee and wet wool. The trooper on duty, Tom Keene, was a good man, younger than me, but level-headed. I'd worked with him on a few search calls before, and when I said Patrick's name, I could see the switch flip in his eyes. He called dispatch, had them start pulling the hiker registration logs from the harbor and the park office. Within an hour, we knew the route Patrick had filed a remote stretch of the coastal section of the Tongass, about 50 miles of rough terrain that most locals avoided. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't forgiving either. By the time the volunteers gathered, the rain had turned from a mist to a steady fall. The parking lot filled with pickups, each one loaded with gear tarps, radios, packs. Some of the faces were familiar guides, loggers, even a retired teacher who'd spent her life hiking the trails around town. Folks here don't wait for orders when someone's lost in the woods. We go because we know what it means not to. That first day, we spread out along the access trail where Patrick was last seen. The air was heavy, that kind of cold wet that seeps through layers. You could smell cedar earth and rot all mixed together. We called his name until our voices rasped. Every time the echo came back empty, I felt it settle deeper, that hollow sound that only the forest can make. We found nothing, no footprints, no scraps, no camp, just endless green. That night, the base camp turned quiet early. You could hear rain pinging against the tin roof of the ranger shack. I sat at the map table with Tom and a few others, tracing Patrick's planned route under the dim light. He'd been methodical, that much was clear. Every waypoint was marked with mileage, elevation, and backup coordinates. This wasn't a man who wandered. Whatever had happened, it had been fast or deliberate. On the third day, one of the helicopter teams radioed in. They'd spotted something a few miles off the main path, a small clearing near a stream, what looked like a collapsed tent. We pushed through thick undergrowth, the ground soft beneath layers of pine needles. When we broke into the clearing, I saw it right away, a neat oval where a tent had stood and beside it a backpack. For a second I felt relief so strong it made me dizzy, but that feeling died just as quick. The pack was zipped perfectly arranged. Sleeping bag, rolled tight clothes, folded food sealed in waterproof bags. There wasn't a sign of struggle, not even scattered gear. It looked like he'd packed up, set the bag down, and walked away. No reason, no trail, no goodbye. Tom crouched down beside the pack and opened one of the side pockets. His gloves brushed against a map, dry and clean, untouched by weather. He was ready to move, Tom said quietly. None of us answered. We spent the rest of the day combing the area, sweeping the perimeter in tight grids. Nothing. Not a boot print, not a broken branch. It was like the man had been lifted off the face of the earth. That night, the temperature dropped fast. Fog drifted through the treetops like smoke. Back at camp, one of the volunteers murmured that the forest didn't like strangers. I'd heard that phrase my whole life, but never felt it like I did then. Days blurred after that. Helicopters circled above when weather allowed, their blades chopping the mist into ribbons. Ground crews moved slower, marking trees with orange tape, calling his name into the dark. Each evening I'd sit by the fire with my logbook, writing down coordinates, weather the faces of those still searching. But as the week stretched on, you could see the doubt starting to settle in shoulders, lower eyes tired. It wasn't hopelessness yet, but the edge of it. Linda flew up from Vancouver on the 6th day. She came straight from the airport, still in her work clothes, shoes soaked through, before she even made it to the cabin where we'd set up the incident post. She looked around like she was trying to find something familiar in all that chaos. When she saw me, she just nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't have to. That night, she sat beside the radio, waiting for updates that never came. Around midnight, she asked me if I thought he'd fallen. I told her honestly I didn't know. But in my gut, I didn't believe it. Patrick wasn't careless. He wasn't the type to take chances for thrill or pride. Still, the forest doesn't care what kind of man you are. It'll take anyone given the right moment. By the 7th day, the official tone changed. The troopers called in a forensic team, though none of us said out loud what that meant. I followed Tom through another sector east of the camp where the trees grew close enough to blot out the sky. That's where we found it, the same clearing, the same stream, just quieter somehow. His footprints had long since been washed away, but something about the air there felt off, like it was holding its breath. We spent hours moving through that clearing, scanning for anything the first team might have missed. It was me who noticed the small depression near a fallen log, the shape of a boot sole, maybe, though the rain had softened the edges. I called Tom over. We marked it, photographed it, but in truth, it led nowhere. Just another whisper in the dirt. That night, sitting outside under the tarp, I stared into the fire and tried to imagine what could have happened. Maybe he'd heard something and followed it, an animal, a voice. Maybe he'd seen a trail marker and gone to check. Maybe he'd planned to loop back and lost his sense of direction in the fog. But every version I tried broke apart on the same question: why pack everything up first? Why leave the one thing keeping you alive in this wilderness? When we finally called off the search, the air felt heavier than before, like the forest had closed itself again. The official word was no trace found. I signed off on the last log entry, then stood by the truck as the others drove off one by one. By evening, it was just me and the sound of the rain starting up again. I don't know why I stayed there so long, watching the light fade. Maybe I thought if I waited long enough, something in those trees would move a shadow, a shape, any sign of him. But nothing did. In the days that followed, Ketchikan went back to its rhythm. Boats came in, tourists walked the docks, life carried on. But for me, the forest didn't sound the same anymore. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like a whisper too close. I caught myself listening for his name in it. Months passed, and then years. His family held a small memorial back in Washington. I couldn't make it, but I sent a letter, told Linda that her brother had been steady and sure, and that if anyone could have found peace out there, it was him. I meant it, but I didn't believe it. The truth was, something about that disappearance didn't sit right. Experienced hikers don't just vanish, not like that. Not with everything packed and ready to go. Every once in a while, hikers would mention strange stories from the deep forest. A noise in the fog, a figure seen between the trees. Whispers about old cabins built high in the branches by poachers decades ago. Folks around here talk like that when the nights get long. Most of it's nothing but folklore, though a part of me always wondered if Patrick had stumbled into something he wasn't meant to find. Years rolled on. The case faded, the reports yellowed with time, and still his name came up in the same breath as all the others, the ones the forest kept. By 2022, I'd stopped expecting any kind of answer. That's when the call came in. A forestry crew had found something deep in Tongass, 7 miles past the last mapped trail. "You'd better come take a look," Tom said over the line, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Even before he told me what they'd found, I knew. I felt it in my chest, that same stillness that had hung over the clearing 9 years earlier. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, the rain tapping against the window just like it had that morning when Linda first called. All those years later, and it sounded exactly the same. Whatever the forest had hidden, it was ready to speak now. But I don't think any of us were ready to hear what it had to say. When Tom called that morning, his voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries weight before the words even come. He said the forestry crew had found something out past Devil's Spine, a section of the Tongass I knew well enough to never hike alone. I asked what it was, and all he said was, "You'll want to see it yourself." By the time I drove to the base station, the sky was heavy with rain, and the air felt thick, that dense metallic stillness that always shows up before bad news. Tom met me in the parking lot, hood pulled up, boots splattered with mud. He didn't speak until I was standing right next to him. "They found a body," he said. Then, after a pause, "It's Patrick. We flew out in a chopper that afternoon. The pilots had to fight the wind leaning the aircraft into the gusts that rose off the treetops. From above, the forest looked endless, a dark sea of green stretching as far as you could see. There's something humbling about it, realizing how easily a man can disappear in that kind of vastness. The landing zone was nothing more than a rough clearing marked with orange tape. 2 forestry workers stood waiting. They looked shaken pale, even through the mist, like men who'd seen something they couldn't quite put words to. They led us through a maze of fallen trunks thick with moss and ferns that came up to the knees. The air smelled of cedar and decay, the kind of wet rot that clings to your clothes. We stopped when one of them pointed upward. That's when I saw it, a cabin suspended between 4 massive firs about 12 feet off the ground. No ladder, no rope, just a weathered wooden box hanging there like it had grown into the trees themselves. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a secret. Tom and I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it. One of the forestry guys, Mark, said they'd been mapping the area when they spotted it through the canopy. He climbed up using tree spikes, thinking it was just some old hunter's shelter. His voice trailed off when he said what he found inside. I could see his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette, even though the rain had started again. He was sitting up, he said, like he'd been waiting for something. The state police had already secured the scene, but they let me climb up with one of the forensic techs. The wood was slick under my boots, every nail head rusted flat. When I reached the door, I saw that it had been sealed, 3 boards nailed across it from the inside. The tech pried them loose and the door creaked open, releasing a smell that froze me where I stood. Not the sharp stench of something freshly dead, but the dry, powdery scent of long decay mixed with mold and pine. The light from my headlamp caught the inside a skeleton slumped against the wall, the skull resting a few feet away, clothing still clinging to the frame in faded patches of blue and brown. Beside the body was a backpack. I knew that pack same model Patrick had bought at Gary's shop 9 years earlier. It looked untouched, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Inside were freeze-dried meals, a pot, a water filter, even a sealed gas canister. Everything neatly arranged, almost reverent. What struck me most was the order. There was no sign of panic, no chaos, just the quiet remains of a man who'd somehow sealed himself into a box he could never leave. The techs began their work photographing, cataloging, marking evidence tags on each item. I stayed crouched near the doorway, staring at the boards that had held the door shut. The nails were driven from the inside, their tips bent where they'd hit the outer frame. Patrick had locked himself in. I thought about the scratches we'd later find on the wall beside him, long, uneven gouges torn into the wood. Fingernail marks. There was no mistaking that kind of desperation. Whatever had happened, he'd been conscious long enough to fight his way toward a door he'd sealed himself. When we climbed down, the rain had eased into a mist, drifting low through the trees. I asked Mark if there'd been any sign of how Patrick got up there in the first place. He shook his head. No ladder, no rope, just 4 smooth trunks rising into the air. Maybe there used to be one, he said softly. Maybe it fell. None of us said what we were all thinking, that if it had fallen, it hadn't been an accident. Back at base, the mood was different. Relief, yes, but also unease. Finding him after all these years should have brought closure. Instead, it opened something worse, a puzzle without reason. The lab work came back days later. The food was still sealed. His body showed no signs of malnutrition, no broken bones from a fall. But there was a hairline fracture at the back of the skull, not enough to kill him outright, but enough to leave him disoriented, vulnerable. The official cause was listed as hypothermia, but that didn't explain why he'd been up there or why he'd shut himself in. The more we learned, the stranger it got. The cabin didn't exist on any Forest Service record. No permits, no construction notes, no map references. It was as if it had been built off the books decades ago. Tom and I started asking around town, old loggers, hunters, anyone who'd been in the woods long enough to remember. One man, a retired guide, told us he'd heard stories back in the 80s about poachers building hideouts high in the trees to avoid bears and rangers. They'd use rope ladders they could pull up at night. It made sense in a grim way. That kind of place could have been forgotten once the men who used it moved on or died. If Patrick had stumbled across it, maybe lost, maybe just looking for shelter, he could have climbed up, not realizing what he was getting into. If that rope ladder came loose, he'd be trapped. A blow to the head, whether from a fall or something else, might have left him too weak to climb back down even if he could. It was a neat theory, but it fell apart the second we thought about those boards across the door. There's no reason a man dying of cold would use his last strength to seal himself in tighter, unless he was afraid of something outside. That possibility sat heavy in my chest. I'd been in those woods my whole life. I'd seen bears, wolves, even the occasional big cat, but nothing that could drive a man to hammer boards over his only exit. This wasn't fear of an animal. This was fear of a person. Tom went quiet for a long time after that. I could tell the same thought was running through his mind. What if Patrick hadn't just found the cabin? What if someone had led him there? Maybe he'd stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see. Illegal hunting logging something that needed to stay hidden. The idea of poachers still operating that deep in the Tongass wasn't far-fetched. You can disappear out there for months if you know how. We spent weeks digging through old case reports trying to match up any incidents in that area around 2013. There were a few complaints. Gunshots heard missing deer, a destroyed ranger station camera, but nothing solid. Whoever was out there had been careful. Too careful. The forest eats evidence. 9 years of rain will erase almost anything. At night, I'd find myself replaying what Patrick must have gone through. The head injury, the confusion, the fear. Maybe he saw shapes moving below, voices calling through the trees, and in his panic, he did what felt safest, hammering the boards over that door, turning the cabin into his fortress. He wouldn't have known he was sealing himself in for good. The thought of that, of him sitting there cold, hurt, listening for footsteps that never came. It's the kind of thing that doesn't let you sleep easy. The report we filed didn't have room for that kind of speculation. On paper, it stayed clean accidental death due to exposure. But off the record, no one in that room believed it was that simple. Too many pieces didn't fit. The abandoned camp, the injury, the barricaded door, it all pointed to something deliberate. Someone had been out there with him, and they'd made sure he'd never tell what he saw. Linda flew in again when the remains were confirmed. I met her at the airstrip, the same gray drizzle hanging low over town. She looked older, but steady, her voice even when she spoke. "At least he's home now," she said. I wanted to tell her we'd find out who did it, but I couldn't make myself say the words. Too much time, too little evidence. The forest keeps its secrets better than any person ever could. After the case was officially closed, I went back out once more with the dismantling crew. They were taking the cabin down plank by plank so it wouldn't draw other wanderers in. Standing there among those trees, watching them cut the beams loose, I felt something shift, a kind of quiet anger at how easily a man's story can vanish in a place that big. When the last board came down, there was nothing left but 4 scarred trunks and a patch of bare earth. It looked ordinary again, like it had never held anything at all. On the hike back, I kept turning around, half expecting to see it still hanging there. But the forest had already begun to swallow the space branches closing in where light had briefly touched. That's when it struck me maybe the cabin hadn't just been hidden by accident. Maybe it was built that way from the start, meant to disappear when its work was done. I didn't say that out loud. Some thoughts are better kept between a man and the trees. But as we reached the clearing where the chopper waited, I caught a glimpse of the sky through the fog, a pale, colorless light pressing down through the clouds, and I thought about Patrick's last moments. The cold settling in the silence closing around him, the nails bent under his own hands. He'd been alive when he sealed that door. That fact alone was enough to change everything we thought we knew. By the time we lifted off, the cabin was gone, but the weight of it stayed. We had his name, his remains, even a version of the story that made sense on paper. But sense isn't truth, and I knew we were still missing the part that mattered, the part that explained why a careful man ended up dying in a box no one knew existed. Somewhere out there I felt was the reason. Or worse, the person. And I had a feeling the forest hadn't finished speaking yet. It was weeks after we'd taken the cabin down when Tom called me again. His voice was different this time, not heavy, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from staring too long at something you can't explain. He said the lab reports were back from Anchorage. I remember driving into town that morning through a low curtain of fog. The streets were slick, the air smelled like wet cedar, and the gulls were circling low over the harbor. It felt like any other day, except it wasn't. Tom met me outside the station with a file tucked under his arm, the pages inside already curling from moisture. He didn't say much at first. He just handed me the folder, and I could tell by his eyes that whatever was inside wasn't going to make any of this easier to understand. Inside the report were photographs of Patrick's remains, bone fragments, measurements, close-ups of that small fracture on the back of his skull. The medical examiner had written that it was consistent with a single decisive blow from a flat, hard object. It wouldn't have killed him right away, but it could have left him dazed, maybe even unconscious. The cause of death, though, was listed as hypothermia. The words looked cold and clean on the page, like the forest had finally found its excuse. Still, there was no sign of starvation, no trace of disease, no indication that he'd been lost long before the end. The food in his backpack had never been touched. The sleeping bag he'd left behind at his camp would have kept him alive. That meant he wasn't trapped there because he'd been careless. Something else had driven him into that box, something that made him choose the wrong kind of safety. When I looked up from the report, Tom was standing by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the rain. "You ever seen anyone nail themselves in like that?" he asked. I told him no, not once. Not in all my years working the woods. People try to block things out when they're afraid, sure, snow animals strangers, but not like this, not sealing themselves in. He nodded slow. What if he wasn't alone? That question sat between us for a long while, like we were both afraid of what would happen if we answered it out loud. The next step was to dig into the cabin's past, if you could call it that. The structure didn't exist on any record, but the locals always know more than the maps do. We started talking to old hunters, retired loggers, anybody who'd worked those woods back in the 80s and 90s. It didn't take long for the same story to surface: poachers, men who hunted deer out of season deep enough in the forest that the wardens couldn't track them. They built tree cabins to stay above the bears and keep smoke hidden. Most of them used rope ladders they could haul up when they were done for the day. It was simple, effective, and silent. A perfect place to disappear for a while. That explained how Patrick might have found it, maybe even how he got trapped. But the theory of an accident started to crumble the more we thought about it. He'd been too methodical to just leave his gear behind, too careful to climb into an unknown structure without a way out. And then there was the injury, that blow to the head. You could argue it was from a fall, but I didn't buy it. The location was too precise, too clean. Something about it felt personal. Late that night, after the interviews, Tom and I sat in the station's break room with coffee that had gone cold an hour before. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead and rain ticked against the windows. He spread out a map of the Tongass across the table, the edges still damp from the field. "Let's start from his last known point," he said. He traced Patrick's intended route with a pen, following it north until his finger stopped near where we'd found the cabin. "If he packed up his camp, why leave everything behind?" he asked quietly. I watched the ink bleed a little into the paper, the forest swallowing it whole, even there on the map. "Maybe he wasn't the one who packed it," I said. It was an ugly thought, but once it took root, it didn't leave. If someone else had forced him to pack up, maybe at gunpoint, maybe just out of fear, it explained a lot. The tidy campsite, the untouched food, the calmness before the chaos. Maybe they'd made him carry everything to cover their tracks, led him deeper into the woods, where no one would find him. Then when they reached the cabin, they made him climb. I could see it in my mind, the ladder swinging slightly, the sound of rain on leaves, a man trying to reason with people who'd already made up their minds. Maybe there was a scuffle, a hit to the head, confusion. He gets shoved inside, or maybe he stumbles in, trying to protect himself. The ladder falls. They leave him there. Tom didn't say anything for a while. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. So he nails the door shut from inside, thinking he's safe. He wasn't asking. He was stating it. "Yeah," I said, thinking they'll come back. The next few weeks blurred into routine reports, follow-ups, endless phone calls that led nowhere. The case had already gone cold once, and now it was slipping there again. The forest doesn't give second chances. Every lead we tried to follow was gone before it started. Whatever had happened out there had been buried under nearly a decade of rain and silence. The people responsible, if there were any, were ghosts by now. Maybe they'd moved. Maybe they'd died, or maybe they were still out there walking the same streets we were. One evening I drove out past the harbor where the road curves along the cliffs and the smell of salt gets into your lungs. The rain had stopped for once and the air was clear enough that I could see the mainland across the water. I pulled over near the overlook and just sat there listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I kept thinking about the scratches on that cabin wall, how deep they went, how many there were. It wasn't just panic. It was resistance. A man fighting a truth he couldn't change. That image stayed with me more than anything else. When the official case report came out, it read like a compromise. Death from hypothermia. Head injury of unknown cause. Probable accident. I'd seen that kind of phrasing before. It's what they use when no one wants to write the word homicide without a suspect. But there was no sense of closure in it. Not for me, not for Linda, not for anyone who'd been part of the search. She came by my place the week after the report was published. The rain had just started up again, the kind of steady drizzle that soaks everything in minutes. She stood on the porch with her coat zipped tight, holding a small wooden box, the one with his ashes. "They said I could scatter them anywhere he'd want to be," she said softly. "I think he'd want to stay here." We drove out to the edge of the forest near the old trailhead where he'd started his hike. The trees were thicker now, the undergrowth heavy with moss and ferns. She opened the box, and the wind caught the ashes before she could say anything. They drifted forward, disappearing into the mist like smoke. She watched until they were gone, then closed the lid and handed it back to me. "He's home," she whispered. But her eyes said something else, something closer to, "He's still out there." When I dropped her off at her motel, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think they'll ever find who did it?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out toward the harbor where the fog was rolling in again, wrapping around the lights like it was trying to erase them. "If they're still breathing," I said finally, "they'll carry it with them forever. And that's its own kind of punishment." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't find comfort in it. Neither did I. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of rain against the roof was steady, rhythmic, almost like tapping nails into wood. I got up, made coffee, and sat by the window. Somewhere deep in those woods, Patrick had made his last decision to shut the world out. Whether it was to protect himself or to keep something out, we'd never know for sure. But as I watched the fog slide down the hillside, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had scared him that day hadn't vanished with him. It was still there, moving through those trees, quiet as breath. The next morning, the cabin was officially gone from the site. The forestry crew had burned the remnants, leaving only 4 blackened stumps where it had once hung. They said it was safer that way, and maybe they were right. But I couldn't help thinking about what we'd destroyed, not just a structure, but the last witness to what really happened. You can tear down walls, you can file away reports, but the truth stays buried somewhere just beyond reach. Sometimes when I drive that way now, I pull over where the road dips close to the tree line. I sit there for a minute, engine idling, and listen. The forest is always moving, even when it looks still, branches shifting, water dripping, a wind that sounds almost like a voice if you let your mind go there. And though I know it's just the weather, there are moments when it feels like the woods are trying to speak, to tell me the part of the story we never found. That's what lingers the longest. Not the fear, not even the mystery, but the silence that follows it. The kind that hums just below hearing, waiting for someone to listen long enough to understand. I still go out there sometimes to that stretch of forest where it all ended. The road gives out a few miles before the old trailhead, now swallowed by brush and moss. You can't even see where the path once cut into the trees unless you know where to look. The cabin's long gone, dismantled and burned, but the air still feels different in that patch of woods. Quieter, as if the forest itself remembers even if no one else talks about it anymore. After the reports were filed and the case was closed for the second time, life in Ketchikan slid back into its rhythm. Boats still came in with the morning tide, tourists still wandered the docks. Rain still fell the way it always had, steady, endless, almost comforting in its repetition. But underneath all that, something small but permanent had shifted. For the people who'd searched for Patrick, for Linda, for me, there was no going back to normal. You can't go through something like that and expect the world to fit the same way again. The official conclusion never sat right with any of us. Hypothermia brought on by exposure, head trauma of uncertain cause, a quiet way of saying we don't know. That file will sit in the state archives until the paper yellows, stamped and sealed as if a line of text could contain what really happened out there. But those of us who walked that forest know better. There are truths that don't make it into the paperwork because they can't be measured or proven, only felt. The feeling of being watched while the rain mutes every sound. The stillness of trees that seem to close in when the wind dies. The sense that someone else's footsteps might be following your own just out of sight. The state didn't pursue further investigation. Too much time had passed, too little evidence remained. The forest had done its work well. Whatever hands had hurt Patrick were clean now, at least in the eyes of the law. But justice isn't always written in ink. Sometimes it exists only in the knowing and the ache that never leaves the people who remember. Linda told me once that she used to dream of confronting whoever did it, demanding to know why. But as the years went on, she said the need for answers faded into something quieter. "They have to live with it," she said. "That's punishment enough." I wish I believed that. A few months after we returned, his remains, Linda sent me a small framed photo of Patrick, him standing by a trailhead somewhere in British Columbia, wind pushing his hair back, that easy half smile he always had. She wrote on the back, "He was happiest out there." I keep it on my desk beside an old compass that never quite points north. When the rain hits the roof and the fog starts to rise, I catch myself glancing at it, wondering if he'd still have gone on that hike if he'd known how it would end. Maybe he would have. Some people need the quiet more than they fear what might come with it. For a long time, I couldn't shake the image of him inside that cabin, sitting against the wall, cold settling into his bones, the boards nailed tight, the forest pressing in around him. It haunted me not just for what it said about his death, but for what it revealed about the kind of fear that drives a person to wall themselves off from the world. That wasn't the act of a man giving up. That was the act of someone trying desperately to survive. And that more than anything is what breaks my heart. He fought to live right up to the end. In the years since, a few of us from the old search team have kept in touch. Every so often over coffee or at the dock, the conversation drifts back to that summer of 2013. Nobody speaks of it directly, not anymore, but it's there in the pauses, in the way we stare out toward the tree line when the fog rolls in. The forest took a piece of all of us. You don't come out of something like that untouched. It changes how you move through the world, how you notice silence, how you read shadows, how you measure trust. There was a time I thought we'd find some kind of answer, that persistence would be enough. I learned the hard way that truth isn't always something you find. Sometimes it's something you have to live with. That's what Linda did. She sold her place in Vancouver and bought a small house near the coast, somewhere quieter. She said she wanted to be closer to the water, that she liked the sound of the wind coming off the bay. We still talk every Christmas. She never asks for updates anymore. There aren't any. The case remains as it was closed, unresolved, and painfully real. For me, I stayed here. This town has its hold on me just like the forest does. I still help when a hiker goes missing, or when someone gets turned around in the fog. We've lost a few over the years, though most come back. When I'm out there moving through the trees, I catch myself listening not for voices or footsteps, but for something older, something buried in the air. I don't believe in ghosts, not in the way movies tell it, but I believe places remember. And sometimes when the wind shifts just right, it feels like the woods are whispering his name back to me. The spot where the cabin once hung is unremarkable now. 4 firs weathered and scarred, standing like silent sentinels. The undergrowth has reclaimed everything else. A person walking by wouldn't notice anything unusual, but I see it every time, the way the light bends there, softer, almost reverent. The forest covered its wound, but it didn't heal it. Maybe it never will. Every now and then, hikers still ask me about the story. They've heard bits and pieces, the man who vanished the cabin in the trees, the mystery the forest swallowed whole. They want to know if it's true. I tell them what I can, but mostly I tell them to be careful. Respect the woods, keep your wits, never travel alone. They usually laugh, thinking I'm just an old man trying to scare them. But sometimes when the laughter fades, they catch the look in my eyes and grow quiet. That's enough. I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to listen. Time moves on, but stories like this don't end, they settle. They sink into the soil, into the water, into the quiet spaces between roots. They stay alive through the people who carry them. I think about that whenever I walk the edge of the Tongass. The forest hums with a sound you can't quite name, part wind, part memory. Maybe that's how the world keeps its secrets through the things that never stop echoing. When I think of Patrick now, I don't see the cabin, or the bones, or the cold. I see him standing in that shop with Gary, tracing his finger over a map, smiling the way only someone in love with the wilderness can. He wasn't reckless or naive. He just trusted that nature, like people, could be understood if you learned its rhythm. And maybe that trust was his undoing, or maybe it was his grace. Either way, it's what I choose to remember. 9 years is a long time for the woods to hold a secret. They gave him back eventually, but not the answers. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Not everything is meant for the living to know. Some truths stay where they fell, and the rest of us just learn to live with the silence they leave behind. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.